May 24, 1940, 4 p.m. Imagine you are a British soldier standing on the salt-sprayed dunes of Dunkirk. Behind you is the English Channel, cold, gray, and impossible to swim. In front of you, just 15 miles away, is the most terrifying sound in human history, the rhythmic mechanical thrum of General Heinz Guderian's Panzer divisions. Over 300,000 men, the entire soul and future of the British Army, are trapped. They are exhausted, outgunned, and cornered against the sea. The German Wehrmacht is not just winning, they are about to deliver a blow that will end World War II before the sun sets. Total victory is 4 hours away, and then the impossible happens. The roaring engines suddenly cough and die. The clanking of tank treads stops. A deafening silence falls over the front lines. A single signature on a piece of paper has stopped the fastest army on Earth dead in its tracks. For 48 hours, the most lethal killing machine ever built simply waits. History calls it the Halt Order. The British call it a miracle, but for the German High Command, it was a psychological suicide. This isn't just a story about a military mistake. This is the story of how the most powerful army in the world defeated itself through the one thing they were supposed to be immune to: indecision. To understand why Hitler let the British escape, you have to look past the tanks and into the toxic ego of the German High Command. This wasn't a failure of technology, it was a failure of the unchecked authority gradient. At the bottom of this pyramid were the aggressive architects, men like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel. They were the masters of blitzkrieg. In just 3 weeks, they had shattered every Allied line of defense. They were the junior pilots of this war, hands on the throttle, pushing forward with mechanical precision. They didn't want to stop, they wanted to crush. In the middle sat Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He was a relic, a World War I general commanding a World War II army. To him, these panzers weren't tools of victory. They were precious assets that needed to be protected like fine china. He looked at the map and saw ghosts. He worried about the marshy terrain of Flanders and the possibility of his tanks getting bogged down in the mud. He was a man of caution in an age of aggression. And at the very top was Adolf Hitler. In May 1940, Hitler was intoxicated by his own myth. Poland had been crushed in 4 weeks. Denmark and Norway were secured. France was collapsing, but success creates a strange type of paranoia. Hitler's ego was so massive that it began to warp his reality. He couldn't provide the one thing tank warfare demands: trust in his field commanders. Guderian and Rommel were screaming to attack. Von Rundstedt was whispering caution. And Hitler, oscillating between megalomania and paranoia, chose to listen to the wrong voice. By May 20th, German tanks had reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. In 10 days, they had accomplished what Germany couldn't do in 4 years of trench warfare during World War I. They were invincible. But that invincibility created a latent vulnerability. The German High Command became obsessed with preserving their success, rather than completing it. The Panzers were no longer weapons, they were trophies. Von Rundstedt's fears about the mud weren't entirely unfounded, but they were disproportionate. Yes, there were canals, yes, the ground was soft. But the British Army was broken. They were retreating in chaos, abandoning their heavy equipment, their morale shattered. This was the moment to take the ultimate risk. Instead, the Germans fell into the champion's trap. It's like a world-class boxer who refuses to throw a knockout punch because he's afraid of bruising his knuckles. They were so terrified of losing a single panzer division that they allowed an entire enemy army to walk away. Hitler was operating in a fog of war, but that fog wasn't on the battlefield. It was in his mind. His inner ear was sending him 3 contradictory fatal signals. Signal 1, the ego of the air. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, made a desperate, arrogant promise. He told Hitler that his bombers alone could destroy the British on the beaches. He wanted the glory for himself, desperate to prove that air power could win wars without the army. Hitler, wanting to reward his loyal deputy, believed a lie over the tactical reality of his generals. Signal 2, the political fantasy. Hitler harbored a bizarre, unrequited admiration for the British Empire. Multiple sources suggest he believed that if he didn't humiliate them, if he allowed them an honorable escape, they might be more willing to negotiate a peace. He was playing a political game with soldiers' lives as the currency. Signal 3, pure paranoia. He simply did not trust his generals. He feared they were moving too fast, that they would create a vulnerability he couldn't control. He saw threats that didn't exist because he couldn't see the horizon. This is cognitive disorientation in its purest form. His instruments, the field reports from Guderian, told him to attack, but his inner ear told him to wait, and in high-stakes warfare, hesitation is death. From May 24th to May 26th, the Panzers sat motionless, engines idling, crews smoking cigarettes, waiting for orders that made no sense. 15 miles away, Operation Dynamo began. The British were pulling off the impossible, Destroyers, fishing boats, yachts, and pleasure craft, anything that could float raced across the channel. The beaches were a scene of organized chaos. Men stood waist-deep in the water for hours, waiting for a boat, any boat. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, strafing the crowds, but Goering's Luftwaffe couldn't finish the job. The weather turned foul, British Spitfires contested the skies, and as history has proven time and again, you cannot sink an army with bombs alone. The Panzers, the only weapon that could have sealed the trap, remained silent. By the time Hitler finally lifted the Halt Order on May 26th, the window had closed. The British had established a defensive perimeter. The evacuation was no longer a hope, it was a reality. By the time the German tanks finally rolled onto the sands of Dunkirk, the last boats were disappearing into the fog. 338 2026 Allied troops were rescued. Churchill called it a miracle, but it wasn't divine intervention. It was German hesitation. Hitler would later call the Halt Order one of the greatest mistakes of his life. Guderian would spend the rest of his career writing bitterly about the lost opportunity. But the numbers tell the true story. Those 338,000 men? They became the iron core of the army that would fight in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Normandy. They were the veterans who trained the divisions that would land on D-Day 4 years later. Dunkirk allowed Britain to survive 1940. Britain's survival meant the war continued, which meant America eventually entered, which meant Hitler was forced into a two-front war he could never win. All because of 48 hours. In high-stakes environments, unclear command structures are catastrophic. When field expertise is overruled by political ego, when hesitation is mistaken for wisdom, and when an unchecked authority gradient allows one man's disorientation to paralyze an entire system, people die, and wars are lost. The Germans had the best tanks, they had the best training, they had the best generals, but they had the worst command structure in history. What if the order was never given? If Guderian had rolled through Dunkirk on May 24th, the British army would have been erased. Churchill's government would likely have fallen. A negotiated peace would have been inevitable. No Battle of Britain, no D-Day. Hitler would have turned east in 1941 without a Western front to worry about. The Halt Order wasn't just a military mistake. It was a psychological breakdown masquerading as strategy, and it changed the course of human history forever. It was the day a mechanic's dream of a perfect preserved army became the nightmare that lost the war.